It's pretty rare nowadays that when we design a garden that the client doesn't want some sort of lighting within that design. In this video, I'm going to help you to avoid making some of the mistakes that I've made over the last 14 years and help you to produce some good, clear plans that are going to really enhance your designs and transform your clients' gardens at night. What feels like a very long time ago, I designed my first garden with lighting, and being a little bit naive, I simply specified around about 10 lights within the garden that I thought would look good and create some nice effects. I brought an electrician in, pointed out where I wanted the lights and handed over and left him to it. I was then given a rather large quote, but thought, you know what, we need to get this right. So instructed the electrician and set him about sourcing the lights and installing them within this nice new garden. Well, when the Sparky started to install what can only be described as football-sized lights within the garden, I knew at that point I'd probably made a mistake and should have specified a little bit better. And it was at this point I decided that I needed to learn a little bit more about lighting design and ensure that my plans were concise and clear so that we wouldn't make that same mistake again. And hopefully I can help you a little bit now so as to avoid the same problems. Now, a good lighting plan needs to do three key things. First of all, we need to specify the lights, the type of lights and where they're going. Next, we need to be a little bit more specific with how they're going to be powered or how they're going to be run. And thirdly, probably most importantly, we need to be really clear, the same as we are with all our gardens, so that there's no confusion for either the client or the electrician. As with all design, this is going to be a combination of artistic flair, technical knowledge and a good ability to communicate. As well as working through this with you today, I'm also going to be sharing some of my favourite brands as well as a really good supplier that I think is going to help you with your lighting plans in the future. And this particular supplier helps me to create some of the effects that I really like as well as improving my profit margin. So let's get started. First of all, like anything, we need to understand what the client wants and what's best for the garden. Now sometimes the client has been around to a friend's house, or maybe they've been to a hotel or a restaurant and they've seen the sort of lighting effects that they really want to achieve within their own garden. But in a lot of cases it comes down to the client brief and understanding how the client uses the garden and what we think then will translate as good lighting design. So the first place I like to start is how are they actually going to use the garden, and then I chat through these key elements.
So access. Do they need to use the garden or go through the garden to get to the house or maybe another part of the living space, such as a garden office, for example? Clearly this is where practical lighting is needed, such as to illuminate a pathway or some steps. Within this garden, you can see that there was a main pedestrian access through the garden up to the house with various steps and pathways. So we had to make sure that these were lit well so as to avoid tripping up or down the steps and to stop walking in the flower beds. There's the view out. In the wintertime, a lot of people only see their garden at the weekends as it's dark before they get home from work. Yet modern architecture often allows and incorporates big windows and lots of glass. Lighting can allow people to enjoy their garden in this way when they look out in the evening. I tend to mention this if I see the view over the garden is important. Sometimes it's more about usability. This garden was owned by a couple who worked very hard, and the idea of extending their view over the garden at night when they got home was really key in the end. And then we've got use. Now this is probably the most obvious, I think, and again, so many gardens are now designed for entertaining or enjoying in an evening, if the weather is good enough, that is. This client wanted to have a cosy area to be used all year round when they got back from work, and the lighting either side of the fireplace as well as the light from the fire itself did a great job. And then finally, is there a feature, or are you going to add a feature within the garden that would look particularly good at night? If the brief suggests a water feature or maybe some feature trees like in this garden, this always seems like an obvious option to me.
I tend to find that allows me to consider the real requirements for the garden and what I need for the bare bones. Clearly budget has to come into it at this stage as well. I'm talking that through with the client and giving them a rough idea of the sort of money I quite often use a round figure, so sort of say, look, it might cost you maybe £150 per light fitting. That's to include obviously connections from the electrician, the drivers, the cabling, the installation, etc. Just as a very ballpark, which always helps the conversation along at a later stage. Then also, once we get to the point where we've got all the basic lights in the key areas that we want to do, we also need to think about the areas in between. We might want to add a little bit more atmosphere to the garden, as well as creating a general glow.
So this is a garden I designed a few years back, and the lighting needed to give the clients a great view out, but also be practical, as there were some steps and a pathway leading around the garden, as well as allowing them to use the jacuzzi in an evening. So I started by adding lights firstly around the steps. I always think this is a key, as it's really important from a safety point of view. Next, there was a water feature that had to be lit up, and around the jacuzzi we needed some light there too. Now what we don't want is a load of isolated spots of light throughout the garden, so we created a general glow whilst also not creating a garden that looks like Blackpool illuminations. And so featured trees seemed like the next obvious choice, as we had quite a few. And finally, there were a few areas that I thought might seem a bit dark, so we added some light in these areas too. And these are some of the effects.
Now, there are a few key lights that are really obvious and I tend to use a lot in my different garden design. The first, and probably the most obvious, is this little spike spotlight. It's adjustable, so we can move it around, turn it around and light up any key features, maybe a pathway, something like that. This is a pure LED fitting, so it's got a chip within there rather than a bulb, and it's quite unobtrusive. Next, recessed lights. They come in all different shapes and sizes, but this is the idea. Obviously they get built into a structure. It might be uplighting from a deck or patio like this, or it might be within a wall shining out over a step. These are great fittings and can come in all sorts of different colours, shapes and sizes. And then we've got wall lights. This particular one is an up-down pillar light, which can be fixed to the wall like so.
And these are great because they tend to bounce light off the surface that they're attached to and give a general glow over the garden. And then you've got lighting within water. It's a great option, we use it all the time. You can use lighting within water to highlight an effect such as the rippling water over a water wall, or maybe just the flow from a water blade like you can see here. We've uplit this one, but also, like this example shows, you can put the light within the blade itself, and water carries light really well. So I'd always suggest you use lighting within water if at all possible.
And there's clearly a lot of variations, both in brand, size, style, colour, but they're just four that I tend to use quite a lot. Then, as well as the actual fittings, we need to think about how they're going to be powered. And there are three key ways in which we can power these lights. Now forgive me because we're going to get a little bit technical at this stage. So we're going to start with LED lighting, which is probably the most obvious when it comes to out and about within the garden. There's actually two different types of LED lighting that can be used. First of all, we've got the old style LED lighting, which came in perhaps a little bit earlier, where we take a transformer, like something like this. This is quite a big and bulky one, two cables going out for two different lights. This is really for changing the power supply down from 240 volt, which is what your sort of standard power supply is in your house, knocking it down to 12 volt. And with that we would use lights that have changeable bulbs. Originally we started using this with halogen bulbs, and obviously as that's phased out we've gone to LED. We now tend to stick to these MR16 light bulbs, which are quite good, available in various different colours. We can go from anything from sort of really cold white, sort of really almost blue-like light, to warm white, which can be really quite orange, and there's a whole raft in between. That's one of the benefits, is we can change the colour, but also we can change the bulbs. They're relatively inexpensive. I mean, obviously they're about £5–6, I think, most of these, so that's a really good option. Or, as I showed you with the spike spot before, we can go for more of a pure LED type light where there's a chip inside it. That requires a driver, one like this, and that can be wired in series, and there you don't change the light bulbs at all. They have quite a long lifespan. We're going to come on to quality of fittings in a little bit, but one of the benefits of spending a little bit more is you tend to get a much longer lifespan of that chip. The downside is you can't control the colour of the light once it's been installed, so you have to pick whether it's going to be cold white or whether it's going to be warm white right at the very, very beginning. If the client sees it and then goes, actually, yeah, would much rather have gone for a warmer white, you're going to have to change the whole fitting. And then after those two options, the third one that we tend to use is simply 240 volt. That tends to only be wall lights, and it tends to be when it's connected to the house. Maybe an electrician's already put a power supply in. Or occasionally we might be building a wall or a structure within a garden where we can run some armoured cable up to that, because obviously we can't use the lower voltage cabling, and that tends to require this type of bulb, again LED, but with slightly different fitting there. This is a GU10. Again, you can change the colour of that, and it works really, really well. But like the pillar light I showed you earlier, the 240 really needs to be fixed to a strong structure where the cable is not going to be accessible, or at least isn't going to get knocked or damaged in any way. Whew. Still with me, I hope. I'm really sorry, the technical side of things, it's not as sexy as perhaps some of the design stuff we're going to be discussing, but you know, it's all very relevant, very important that you have this knowledge so you can avoid making those mistakes that I've made in the past. And the next, very dull, I'm afraid, but very equally important bit of information that you need to understand is the IP rating of a light fitting. IP stands for ingress protection, relates to dust as well as to water. Some lights have a higher IP rating, so they might be able to submerge these underwater. Equally, some don't need such a high IP rating, such as a wall light that might only need to be able to withstand the usual rain. However, we do need to understand this, and we need to make sure it's appropriate for the location and the type of light that we're using outdoors. Now, online, I found this this table, which I think is really, really useful. And if you can always screenshot this if you like. It's a great reference point.
So all garden electrical elements and things like lights will have an IP rating. They start with IP, and then the first number relates to the dust and foreign particles. The second is about water. So an example could be a pump for a water feature, which is likely to be IP68. A pillar light on a house wall, however, might only be IP54. If you need more information on this, your electrical wholesaler should be able to help you.
Next, we need to think about how your client's going to turn their lights on and off. This is very relevant when it comes to the designers. We need to be able to tell the landscaper or the electrician where to take the cables back to, where they're going to terminate. So you need to decide whether or not, firstly, you could have a single switch or multiple switches where you take all the cables back to, where you're going to be able to control the lighting, say from a simple switch on the wall. I will say this is probably, although it sounds like the simplest option, it's probably one of the most complicated from the landscaper's point of view, unless you're putting in a solid structure. Primarily because all the cables got to be hidden. So if you're going to start putting a switch on an outside wall, how are the cables going to get to that wall if the house has already been built and plastered inside? And that's why 99% of the time I tend to go for a wireless setup. Like Symphony, one of the brands that we tend to use, they have a great setup, and it's a box that you simply take all the cables back to, can go pretty much anywhere in the garden, so long as you can get a Wi-Fi signal from within the house. That's because the way that it works is that it communicates through an app on your phone, or your client's phone they can download an app. There's a box that plugs into the back of their Wi-Fi. That then communicates with the Light Symphony box outside in the garden, and just like that, they can turn the water feature on, they can turn the lighting on while they're sitting out in the garden, while they're inside the house looking out. And the great thing here is most people carry their phones with them at all times, or maybe they've got their iPad, but they tend to have their phones with them all the time. So if they are sitting out in the garden and notice it's getting a little bit dull, dusky, they can just simply get out their phone, turn the lights on. Now that does work really well, so long as you can get a Wi-Fi signal from out in the garden. If you can't, or if the clients don't necessarily want to be able to operate their lighting using their mobile phone, there are other options, for instance like the Wise box, where you can simply have a remote control. Completely avoids anything to do with the internet already set up. There's just, again, a box on wherever you want it to be, on the wall or on something fixed, solid, where all the cables go back to. and you get a remote control, you can get multiple remote controls, and obviously the risk with those is the client can lose the remote control, but equally you can always buy some more. They're not difficult to get hold of, so this is a great second option. But whichever way you go, you need to specify how they're going to switch those lights. That's the next key element within your lighting design. Now, the last bit of really technical, perhaps less interesting design elements within the lighting plan is where's the power source coming from and what type of cabling are you going to use within the garden. I tend to get the electrician out at an early stage just so they can look at the house and decide where the power is best to be sourced from. Sometimes it's nice and straightforward. For instance, if you have a new build house, they sometimes might put even a fuse spur on the outside of the building. We've got one of those at the moment, which is great, so it's very, very obvious. Other times might not be so straightforward. We might want to take it from the garage because there's a separate box in there, switching box. Equally, we could potentially, if it's easier, spur off a socket somewhere around the house. But then the electrician might tell you that it needs to go back to the mains board. And this is why we need to get the electrician out at this early stage and not try and specify that ourselves. Yet again, another mistake I've made in the past is to make an assumption that we can take the power from, for instance, a socket that's already on the outside of the house. The electrician's got there and said, no, you need to take this from the main board, which is actually at the front of the house. So we've had to try and get a cable all the way around to the back garden, which has incurred more cost, which it doesn't come across well when you're supposed to have already thought all this stuff through. And then you've got the cabling. You don't necessarily have to go into too much detail in your design about the cabling, other than really anything where there's 240 volt going through needs to be protected, it needs to be armoured, so SWA cabling. Again, talk to your electrician about what's required for the light fittings and the drivers, etc. that you're using. But it's a good idea to understand this, even if you don't put it in the design, because that way when the landscaper comes out, you can make sure that they're potentially doing the right job. If you're brought in just to have a look and see how they're getting on, spot a problem there maybe. But also you might want to specify where some of this armoured cabling goes. I generally do, because I want to make sure that it goes underneath the hard landscaping and it doesn't impact in any of the borders. Although armoured cable can be buried in the ground, it might only be buried at 60 centimetres deep, and it might go through a flower bed where I want to put a tree in at a later stage, which might have a root ball that's 90 centimetres deep. We don't want to find that problem. So by specifying that cable and where it goes, it is a really good idea. Once you've got off a driver or a transformer, and we know it's definitely low voltage, that can be done with a more of a flex, so long as that's protected, or there's no chance of the client going through it with a spade, just because it's not going to give them a shock necessarily, but it's going to be irritating if their lights don't work one night and they don't quite know where that damage might have been. You've got the cabling, and then also there's the drivers, the junction boxes, those sorts of things. It's good to be able to understand those so we can put those in. We might want to say that we want an 18 watt driver over here, so we're going to run armoured cable to that bit, but then separate switch means that we're going to need to run another armoured cable over to here because we need to be able to reach to do this or whatever. But yeah, need to think all these things through. I would strongly recommend that you really get a good understanding of types of power, drivers, transformers, where junction boxes are needed, etc. Good electrician. I know I keep referring back to in these videos about taking them to the pub, but if you know someone who's an electrician, it's sometimes good to take them over and to a pub or cafe, or maybe just invite them around for a drink at your home and just quiz them a little bit. There is a supplier that you can talk to, which I'm going to talk about more at the end of this video, so stay tuned and they can certainly help you with that if not. Okay, that's all the technical stuff out of the way. Now we're getting back to the design side of things. So now we need to bring it all back together and to create the plan.
So I tend to take a template of a new garden design, remove all the unnecessary information that doesn't relate to the lighting, and start here. As you saw earlier, when I start setting out the lights, I do this through coloured spots which relate back to the key to show what they're for. Then I note the power supply and where we're going to terminate all the cables. Then how we're going to switch the lights, any drivers, etc., or any other hardware. Now, I don't show the route of any low voltage cables, as I tend to discuss this with the landscapers on site and again with the electrician. I do, however, show the route of the SWA cable here, as personally I like to make sure this is routed underneath hard landscaping as much as possible and well away from the planted borders. Then the last thing you need, like all good plans, is a key. This can show the type of lights. You might also want to have information on wattage, which can be really useful for the electrician and can help you also ensure that you've got the right type and number of drivers. I specify which switch runs what, so as to stop the tree lights coming on when the water feature is switched on. I'm probably exaggerating a little bit there, but you get the idea. And a few caveats also on cable depth and some additional notes. And that's the lot, good to go.
So earlier I said I was going to share with you some of my favourite brands, as well as one particular supplier that's given me loads of help throughout my career when it comes to lighting design and other elements such as irrigation and various bits and pieces. So if you're still here we go. As far as the four brands I tend to use, Hunza is the first.
Company from New Zealand but stock lights here in the UK. They do loads of great features and have good components and warranties. They're not cheap, but you get what you pay for, right? And on that note, just a quick point here is it's a bit more than just quality you're paying for when it comes to lighting. It's also about longevity. I always say to the client that you can save £50 on a single light, but if that then needs replacing in 18 months' time and your electrician charges you a £60 call-out charge to replace it, it's a bit of a false economy, especially if the alternative has a 7 or even a 10-year warranty.
And then we have Luxar.
This is another great brand, and it's quite similar to Hunza in many ways, but with some great mini lights that are also pretty powerful. And then we've got Collingwood. Now, I tend to use Collingwood more than most, I think. Again, they come with some great warranties. They're perhaps not as long as Hunza, but they are a little bit cheaper. So if you're having 10 to 15 lights within a garden, it can be an affordable compromise.
Finally, Ortus.
Now, for me, this is the best budget type of lighting if I need to use it. It comes with a 2-year warranty rather than your standard 1 year, so I'd expect them to last relatively well. And they're made for a company called Landscape Plus. Now, if you haven't heard of Landscape Plus, these guys are my absolute go-to when it comes to lighting, water features and irrigation. I must buy something from them at least once a fortnight, and they have great wealth of knowledge if you ever need help with anything. Nice guys too. So if you haven't heard from them, check them out online.
And that's it, we're all done. Lighting, planning and designing all done. Don't forget to subscribe if you like this video and you think that we might be able to help you with some other bits and pieces in the future. We're talking planting design next, which I know some of you are going to really love. But until then, happy designing, and I'll see you all very soon.